Hello. Today we're going to be learning more about the Articles of Confederation and why it was so weak. As the colonists created our government, what were they afraid of? Think back to what we've reviewed about the colonial times and the American Revolution and why they declared their independence from England. They didn't want to have another authoritarian government. No more kings. What was their goal or motivation? Well, they didn't want to have any more kings, so they wanted to limit the power of the government. So they wanted to create a limited government, one that was going to have limits on what it could do, unlike living under a king. They wanted to make sure that the central or federal government didn't have too much power. And I want to say that when we use the term central or federal government, that's the same as our national government. Under the system of federalism, we have the national government, state governments, and local governments that we all have to follow the laws and rules for. But right now we're talking about the national government versus the states. So they wanted to make sure that the central or federal government didn't have too much power because they wanted to limit that kind of control, limit the power of the government. All the power was kept with the state governments. And governments could only change things slowly with lots of checks along the way. This is still a principle in our nation today that we don't want to change things too quickly because then if somebody gets into office that has very extreme views, our country could be led in the wrong direction very quickly. So we still do want to have a government where things change slowly and that there are lots of checks along the way. But with the Articles of Confederation, there were so many checks that nothing could be accomplished. Some other things to know about the Articles of Confederation is they established a weak national government. National is the same as central or federal government. Congress could not collect taxes. They were actually heavily in debt after the Revolutionary War, and they had no way to get any money from the states. They could request that states gave them money, but if the states didn't want to give them money, there was nothing they could do about it. They also could not enforce any laws. They only created one branch of government, which was the legislative branch. So they could make laws, but they didn't have an executive branch to make sure those laws were carried out. So they could not enforce any of the laws they made. If a state didn't want to follow the law, or a person didn't want to follow the law, there was nothing they could do about it because they couldn't make sure those laws were being carried out. In order to amend the Articles, all 13 states had to agree. And I want to talk that an amendment is very different than a law. An amendment is actually changing the structure of our government. So we're going to talk more after winter break about how to amend our Constitution. We have 27 amendments or changes to our Constitution that changes the whole structure of the government because the Constitution is the rule book. A law is a procedure that must be followed or a rule that must be followed.
Pardon the interruption. Can all 8th graders please go to study hall for B block? All 8th graders please go to study hall for B block. Thank you. To the gym for study hall. Please go to the gym.
So it was very, very difficult to correct any mistakes that might have been made or for the structure of the government to adapt with changing times or to adapt with changing beliefs and traditions and values. So some of the weaknesses, we've mentioned some of them. Congress didn't have the power to settle disputes between the states. There was no judicial branch to sort out the gray area between the law or sort out any kind of disputes. So the states could fight about lots of different things, and there was nothing the national government could do about it. There was no national court system. Again, no way to dissolve disputes, whether it be with the states or just between people or businesses or branches of the government. There was no national court system. Congress couldn't draft people into the Army. They could only request that states send men to serve. and that became a problem with the War of 1812. 9/13 of the states had to vote in favor of a law in order for it to pass. So that made it very, very cumbersome in order to even pass a law. So the Articles of Confederation had one branch, the legislative branch, to make the laws, and then the states had to vote whether or not to pass the law, and 9/13 of them had to pass. And the states were very, very different back then. They had different cultures, they sometimes spoke different languages, so the idea that they could possibly have so many people agree on something was not a realistic expectation. So they weren't able to amend the Constitution, and they weren't able to pass any laws, basically. There was no president or executive branch to carry out or enforce the laws. Other weaknesses are that the national government couldn't enforce the laws it created. In order to amend the Articles of Confederation, all states had to approve it. The national government couldn't collect the money that the states owed it. Lots of the states were in debt to the national government after the Revolutionary War, but the national government didn't have any way to get them to pay it back. They had no power at all, really. They could not make the states pay. They could only request that they pay, and they couldn't do anything about it if they didn't. Thank you for listening, and we're going to use this information with our next activity. So talk with your table mates for a moment to make sure you got down all the notes that you need.